Hello, I'm Charo Neville, and I'm the curator of the Kamloops Art Gallery, and Donald Lawrence and I are standing in the central gallery in his exhibition, Casting the Eye Adrift. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how the exhibition's organized and give an introduction to the two thematic sections in the exhibition, and then Donald will go through each work. So it's a retrospective exhibition which covers almost 4 decades of Donald's practice. There's a lot of work, probably the earliest is 1987. And so we've divided it, organized it not chronologically, but into these two thematic sections. The first looking at what we might call early works, it's 1990s to mid-2000s. And so some of the themes that come up in these bodies of work really carry throughout Donald's practice, and then we'll carry into the second section, which focuses more on his recent work with cameras Obscura. So some of the core themes are certainly touch on Donald's research interests. He's a visual arts professor at Thompson Rivers University and works in interdisciplinary ways, collaboratively, and with each body of work there's a tremendous amount of research that he undertakes. And so some of those themes, the core themes, are around an interest in the intersections between art and wilderness cultures, urban and wilderness cultures, I should say, and Donald will go into that and I think tease that out when he talks about each of these works. Also early imaging, photographic technologies. We're standing right in front of his underwater pinhole photography project that he'll go into detail about. And also work with surveying, so an interest in amateur and professional interests that come throughout his work, and so detailed surveying of sites. A lot of these projects are massive undertakings that he did at specific sites. The West Coast in particular, and his interest in the outdoors and sea kayaking emerged through these projects. And some major sculptural works where you'll see this DIY construction of frameworks, wood frames with skins. And those appear again when we'll look at his camera Obscura works. And what else can I say? One thing to mention too is that a lot of the way that we've displayed the work, it ties into Donald's interest in museum display and the conventions of display themselves. And so we've included, for example, all of the cameras for making the photographs in this project, drawings, journals, a lot of material in vitrines or cases that are as much a part of the work as, say, the big sculptural works. So hopefully these themes will come out as Donald takes us through each work. So we'll start in 2000, I think. This is the date for this project.
Yeah, it's a body of work called the Underwater Pinhole Photography Project, and it began around late 1997, 1998, and has gone through about the early 2000s. And it's one of the things I might come back to, but that's when these works are from. And so just in this little section here, a number of my interests are apparent. Interests in drawing, including in journals, interests in photography, and interests in sculptural and other three-dimensional objects. So many people will be familiar with the idea of a pinhole camera, often constructed from something as simple as a cardboard box, where light comes in through a very small pinhole-sized opening and forms an image inside exposed onto photographic paper or film. This project takes that very simple idea of the pinhole camera and complicates it, asking, can a pinhole camera be made to work underwater? And so that's what we see here, and this is about the second or third version of them. They take 4" by 5" black and white film, which goes in a hatch in the side, gets made watertight, and then it's lowered into the water with ropes and pulleys and things like that, and operated mechanically, kind of remotely, that way through very simple mechanics. And then it's pulled up to the surface, and chemical fluids are either poured into the top part so that the camera becomes its own portable darkroom as well, or the films can be taken out and processed in a kind of a portable kit that I have. And so the resultant photographs are mostly these kind of black and white ones that you see here. And the one with the starfish is actually the first of these that I managed to create with these cameras, and I was really happy that it worked so well. What you see here are some sketches for quite a fanciful kind of construction, a slalom racing kayak converted into a sort of a floating laboratory for this. And it's, you see it in a film and it works, it does what it purports to do, but it's also a more extravagant idea than is really the most practical way to do some of this. So that idea of the over-elaborated form, that's also a part of my aesthetic, if you like, and the cameras are like that. Everything on the camera does something, but it's also a very complex, almost cumbersome kind of object at the same time. So kind of an idea of practicality and excess kind of tied into one structure. This, I believe, was the first planning drawing for them, so kind of a rough sketch that actually is very close to the way I constructed the first one in the end. Is there anything else I'd like to say here? I'll just toss in one anecdote. Use my terms urban and wilderness culture, Charo, and that's great. You also tossed in art and wilderness cultures, and that's equally a part of it too. The art culture is obviously another dimension that comes into play, and that's primarily a part of urban culture, but in this case it's trying to take art culture outdoors, or vice versa too. So.
Yeah, and people will see that I've used wilderness in quotes throughout, so maybe you want to elaborate a bit on that, and being a social construction and about our relationship with nature.
Sure, I think many artists and writers and scholars are interested in asking questions about what terms like landscape and wilderness mean, and since I've been making work in the late 1980s, early 1990s, those have been kind of prevalent interests for me, and as we'll see throughout the exhibition, many of the artworks are kind of linked to that idea. And so wilderness is complicated by these works. It's not simply something that's out there remote from urban society and that's pristine. It's something that's always in dialogue with urban society. And the very idea of wilderness is, of course, a cultural idea. And you see the roots of that in early literature, and you see it carry on into, through the centuries, into contemporary Western consumer society, which many of these works kind of intersect and are about somehow. And notions of the kind of romantic individual and whatnot. We'll see that more prevalent in some of the works, but they're definitely at play here.
So right now we're looking at a work from 2006, Fiddle Reef Remembered, and this was a project that Donald Lawrence did at the Art Gallery of Greater Victoria in their lab. And I'll let you take it from here to describe that collaborative process. And
sure. The lab is the AGGV's experimental project space. So what we did with it is we used it for a 6-week period to look at a couple of islands that are in Oak Bay in Victoria. One of them being Fiddle Reef, which is this very small, rocky kind of outcrop, if you like, with a lighthouse on it. More correctly, what it has is the base from a former lighthouse, the Fiddle Reef Light Station, which was constructed in the 1890s. And in the late 1970s, early 80s, thereabouts, the lighthouse was taken down and a cylindrical aid to navigation tower put up in its place. So what this project was about for me was about remembering this place that I'd seen when we first moved to Victoria, and that seemed kind of far off, but really it was just kind of like half a mile offshore, a mile offshore. And so when I was older and when I was into kayaking, I thought I'm going to go back to Fiddle Reef, and I went back and found that the lighthouse was actually gone. And so that interested me for a couple of reasons. One, wanting to go back to this place that was, sort of important to me, but also that for a period of time I hadn't noticed that the lighthouse was gone. So I realized that the importance of memories and things that are important to you kind of shift over time. So I've used the word we. It was a collaborative project with Will Garrett Petts, also at TRU, and someone with an interest, also a childhood memory of one of the other islands in Oak Bay. So we had this kind of joint project looking at these two islands, and we invited the public to come in and look at the works in process, and also to contribute their own stories. So many visitors came by, some of them multiple times, and would keep coming back with more and more information and drawings and stories about islands and around Oak Bay, but also other places that this made them think of. So my approach to making this was to first spend a couple of weeks or so, something like that, going out to the island, out to Fiddle Reef, and very carefully measuring it. And you'll see in some of these journals and drawings these exceedingly detailed measurements. And then from those, converting them into these kind of large-scale map-like drawings of the reef that represented the reef at low tide, mid tide, which is about what the model shows, and then high tide, where really all you see is the base of the lighthouse and a few rocks. And what I was doing for that was measuring with literally measuring, taking a lot of compass bearings, and also figuring out a way by a combination of keeping track of where the horizon was and using the height of a kayak paddle to figure out the vertical elevation. So what I found myself doing was kind of inventing my own surveying method, but knowing that what I was really doing was invoking kind of basic surveying principles. So it's one of these kinds of things that runs across sort of like a professional activity of surveying, but figuring it out on my own terms in a kind of a DIY sort of amateur way, and that kind of interests me. And from the first the studies and then the scale maps, I then created this model of the reef. And it's made as a kind of a bricolage of these different materials. Like the rocks are formed from rubber raincoats and rain boots and things like that, and the underlying part from these sort of mostly domestic things like a chair and an ironing board, and then this toy boat here. And they're all things that I got in thrift shops or garage sales around Victoria while I was making this. So the project was also partly about gathering these materials and then making the structure in this kind of unconventional collage sort of way, responding to the materials and what I could find as much as the accuracy of this place. And so it's kind of, on the one hand, quite rough looking, but it's on the other hand quite to scale. So it's kind of got a kind of a balance to it that way.
I think one thing to point out here too is that visitors will notice a lot of models throughout the exhibition. So this model is the work, where a lot of your other model making is preparatory for a larger work.
That's right. Yeah, I think there's three types actually. That characterizes this one perfectly. The artwork wouldn't exist without the model because they're one and the same. Several of them are preparatory. Others, a couple of them came afterwards too, and that's a way to almost like explain a work that might not exist any longer, that's very complex and fits in with another whole science side of thing of the demonstration apparatus and a model being created to demonstrate something.
Okay, so we're standing now in one of the largest works in the exhibition. You can tell its scale by our scale in front of it, a massive undertaking. It's titled Torham Van Fairyland, about 2003 to 2005. And it's a really good example of the way that you worked at a site and did a lot of surveying and a lot of preparatory photographs and drawings in advance of what we see here. And all of that material is also included in the exhibition. And so then in 2005, it was shown at the Contemporary Art Gallery in Vancouver.
The Torham van is a ship that was built in the early 20th century. The name coming from Toronto, Hamilton, and Vancouver, kind of a derivation of the three that was its root. and it was wrecked at the town of Fairyland on the east coast of Newfoundland in 1926. And so that's what this represents. So this represents a Scotch boiler, the term for one of the steam boilers that one of two that would have been built into this ship. And it's an actual size construction in the front here. For the exhibition in the Contemporary Art Gallery, there are actually two of these, as there are at the shipwreck site. The second one was about half the size of this one, and they had a kind of a three-dimensional diminishing perspective in the Contemporary Art Gallery. Here we're featuring just the main one, and nice and kind of well lit here. The construction is made up out of hundreds, perhaps thousands, I'm not sure, parts of wood, each one of them shaped together and carefully fitted together, and all of them pegged together with wooden pegs. And then just the main sections held together with bolts. And that is kind of like an older carpentry kind of way of building something. And covered with these canvas covers created by a former student, Randy Obenhauer, and then pigmented with raw pigment, kind of, I think of it almost like a big three-dimensional pastel drawing. And I have a few interests here, an interest in older technology, especially maritime technology, and the way that something is derelict and lost and overlooked. It's very much just kind of abandoned at the site, and paying a lot of attention to that, going and spending a week surveying it and measuring it, much like the Fiddle Reef project that way, and then carefully reconstructing it. And so you'll see again, like Fiddle Reef, you'll see in the drawings and journals and models and things like that, you'll see a very careful process of carefully surveying the site, photographing it, mapping it, detailed drawings of this otherwise abandoned object, and then a careful planning for how it will fit into the space of the Contemporary Art Gallery, both physically but also in terms of this three-dimensional illusion. And then about a year and a half long period in this case of assembling the thing and disassembling it and moving it. And that's kind of a part of the work too, as we experience here installing it. It's a lot of complexity to piece it all together each time. Let's see what else is good to mention here. I'll also say something about these two blue-colored photographs that are on the wall here. So the blue prints result from a cyanotype printing process where the negative is exposed to emulsion-coated paper in sunlight and then washed in water. And so it's both a beautiful photographic process and also one that can be done on site or remote from a studio. Okay, so the idea of the installation in the Contemporary Art Gallery of this three-dimensional spatially compressed illusion is an interest that's recurring in my work and that I've had from some works I did during my BFA studies where I was looking at illusion in Dutch art of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, and then in Baroque art. And a couple of artworks in Rome, one by Borromini and Andrea Pozzo, use these principles of spatially compressed forms. And so I've for a long time incorporated these ideas of illusion into art making, of which this is the largest and most kind of grandiose example.
So now we're standing in front of a work called The Sled from 1995, and it's actually on loan to us from the Vancouver Art Gallery's collection and includes some photographs that are in the Kamloops Art Gallery's collection. So this work and coinciding work from 1993, Romantic Commodities, really tease out the ideas that Donald was talking about around art and wilderness, in quotes, and urban and wilderness cultures. So this is a good place to start with our mini RV in front of us here.
Sure. The sled was created during an artist residency at the Banff Centre for the Arts in Banff. And so it was kind of partly a response to that landscape, being in the mountain landscape, the winter landscape of Banff, And it was also a direct response to this object here, which I'd become interested in, these kind of small survival storm kits, which show a lone figure kind of crouched inside a shelter, warming themselves beside some rocks and a fire, and holding one of these survival kits in their hand, with that, their survival depending on that. And it interests me as a kind of an example of a commodified experience of the wilderness, and of that whole romantic notion of the lone figure surviving out in the wild. And it's one that I partake in at times during solo kayaking trips and things like that, but that I'm also critical of for the way that it's kind of wrapped up in consumer society. And this would be a product from the 1980s and 1990s, but it has a much longer tradition than that you can trace back through exploration journals and things like that. So it's, many of these works are about something that I very much like and I'm part of, and at the same time hopefully have a kind of a critical perspective on. So what you see here in the construction is it's kind of like the way I referred to the floating kayak darkroom earlier. It's a very fanciful vehicle, so something that's kind of a folly, fits within an architectural realm that way, more so than has the most efficient, most practical kind of outdoor wildernessy quality to it. So what it represents is these kind of rock forms constructed and painted in a very kind of overtly romantic way, resembling the ones on the tin can. And then in lieu of the fire that's represented on the tin can, these kind of things that we have in urban society, but they're wilderness versions of them. So a whisper light, a stove with an outback oven on it, and a Coleman lantern, and a Coleman heater. And so as Charo mentioned, it's kind of like an RV. I think of it as like a low-tech a loner's RV, kind of like a cross between an RV and a caravel, a type of ship of the 16th century, all kind of laden down and loaded with its stuff. And then taken out into the wilderness and assembled into a shelter that mimics this one on the storm kit. And then around the space you see these photographs kind of documenting it out in the landscape, and a film. And the film's shot on Super 8mm film, and the film's all hand processed, so kind of a pre-video form if you like. And that's the same technique that I used for the film that goes with the underwater pinhole photography project. And you see other physical artifacts of clothing, the toque made by my mother, for example, so these kind of personal references. And then a model, which was a preparatory model for this, and then a journal. And in this case, the journal plays off my interest in journals for actual trips and whatnot, but in this case is a kind of a fictional construct of a travel with the sled, and it ruminates on the provisions that we have in here, and how things that might be taken for granted in a city become luxuries out in the wilderness, and that kind of idea. Okay, so we'll go into a little bit of reverse chronology here, but not too much. The sled was from 1995, and this work was from 1992, 1993, belonging to Romantic Commodities, the body of work that preceded and led to the sled. And so as you can see, this particular work, Storm Kit, is an oversized, kind of exaggerated version of the small tin can storm kits, and with basically a replication of the front figure and a couple of 18th century romantic poems on the back. And so I was interested in the early 1990s when I was making this, in this phenomenon that I was starting to see of bottled water. Up to that time, Canada had been regarded as a place of abundant water resources, and all of a sudden it was something commodified, something to be preciously protected and marketed. And so the stockpile here stands in for a stockpile of almost anything that society might need, but was something prescient at the time maybe. And I particularly like this brand of it, Selkirk Springs, partly for the reference maybe to the Selkirk Mountains, but most specifically to the little gold figure on it, which if if the figure here on the can represents the romantic lone individual, the gold figure is the Vitruvian Man, a Roman ideal which was taken up by artists such as Leonardo da Vinci in the Renaissance to determine what the ideal man would be like. And so a very historical urban notion that precedes this later romantic notion.
Maybe you can talk a bit of about how that man appears through your own persona and
Sure.
in the frontiersman that we see in the video, in the sled, and connecting your own kind of personal experience through the outdoors, but in this form of this persona in your work?
Sure, and I think it comes from a combination of, well, many things probably, but say two things. I definitely come from a background of being interested in the outdoors and going camping and things like that, and that clearly traces back to 19th century, 18th century pursuits. And for me, going kayaking and things like that, including solo wilderness trips, I feel that I have a kind of a knowledge of the wilderness and particularly certain environments. Yet, from being an artist and from looking at cultural forms and asking questions about them, notions of rugged individuality and whatnot, they're problematic, right? So you can look at the way that any of those notions, whether we see them in literature, film, or older or contemporary art, they represent a kind of a bringing of urban ideas of those rural and wilderness cultures into society, and almost kind of like capturing that wilderness experience. And so it's kind of I think in most of these works is kind of a celebration and a critique of something at the same time.
Mm-hmm. And in the underwater pinhole photography
Right.
film, you used another actor, and in the sled, you made a shift in using yourself.
That's right, and I think I've gone back and forth in that a little bit about, and maybe it's because some of the works are about figuring myself out a bit. Is this actually me that these are self-portraits of, or are these portraits of traits that I see in others or in popular culture or something? So I'm not even sure that that's settled, but those two ways of working are about an exploration of that. And I think in more recent works, I've actually maybe depicted myself where others less overtly, and you enter into the work, like the participant enters into the work. But now perhaps I just accept these are just things that interest me, and I make them, rather than feeling like I have to keep asking that question.
Mm-hmm. Definitely what people will see when they go further into this corridor are representations of this kind of enjoyment of mm-hmm. nature through postcards or museum display, and the consumer aspect of that as well.
Yes, absolutely, although recognizing that many times those representations of those activities are staged and faked, whether in my own work to pick up on these traditions or in the creation of postcards and things like that. So it's in the end, it's a complicated relationship, and it's mm-hmm. Made more complicated every day, it seems.
And one more part of this body of work to point out is the rock, because that ties into a lot of your sculptural work and the rocks that figure throughout the exhibition.
Yeah, so sure. So far I've talked about the storm kit, but let me talk about romantic commodities as a whole now. So the title of the body of work, I think, makes sense in terms of what we're talking about. What you see when you look around the other part of the gallery here is maybe 3 or 4 things. You see, firstly, a work that I think is quite easy to kind of understand. It's simply 3 photographs of displays in Banff that represent these different kind of cultural realms. One of them is a museum, so you have a display case, a vitrine that carefully protects the climbing rope that would have belonged to one of the Swiss alpine guides brought to Banff to represent Banff as Canada's Switzerland in the 1890s. And then beside that, you see a photograph of one of these Whisperlight stoves in a store display. So something treated in the same rarefied way as the objects in the museum down the road, yet as a commodity. And then the further one you see, the third photograph, shows a deer's foot stuck in a piece of tree that's been cut out of the tree and put into a display cabinet. And that's in the older historical museum in the city that represents kind of 19th century natural history museums and kind of these earlier traditions, these earlier examples of the current traditions. And so all of those represent my interest in museum culture and display, as Charo's mentioned once or twice. You see a painted work that's kind of like between a three-dimensional and painterly kind of approach, and that again has this very illusionistic kind of take on things. The next part you'll see is another one of these constructions of a rock, and what Charo's directed me to here is to note that throughout many of these works, most perhaps, there's one way or another there's an interest in rocks, and the rock itself being a very romantic form. Ruskin wrote about it. He wrote a treatise about rocks, and you see it, though it's not quite a natural rock. It's a wood and canvas construction, skeletal wood on frame. So it forms the prototype for all these later works. And it was actually constructed not as a sculpture, but as a part of a backdrop for photographic tableau. It was only after making it that I thought, it's kind of got interesting sculptural properties, and it's kind of guided my work since then. Among other things in a vitrine, various works in progress from that time. You'll also see a carefully made model with miniature versions of all of these things for the Romantic Commodities work, and that was used specifically to propose an exhibition to Stride Gallery in Calgary.
So we are standing in front of the Drumheller albertosaurus, an actual dinosaur bone that has been a family artifact in Donald Lawrence's family since you were a child. And traveled with you across the country, and really is kind of at the heart of your early interests, certainly sculptural and in terms of the museum display that you've been talking about, but also thinking about objects in relation to your art practice.
Sure, it's about a 3 foot, something like that, leg bone, the femur from an Albertosaurus, and it was excavated in Drumheller by my brother Hamish when he was maybe about 11, 12, something like that, in I think 1966, and I was about 3 years old at the time. And so, as Charo says, it's something that's traveled back and forth across the country a couple of times as the family's moved, and has always been this kind of strange thing to carry back and forth, but there it is. And I like the fact that it still exists in the crate that it was packed in back then, and rests in its bed of plaster that it was set in at the time to keep all the pieces together. There's a video here that shows my father talking about the bone and about my brother finding it, and the importance of, to the family at that time of it, and also to the way it relates to some of my other artworks. The interest in rocks. It's a rock. Because a fossil of course is a mineralized replacement for a bone, and it's weighty, it's heavy, so it's like the underwater cameras. It looks a bit like the steam boiler in terms of its coloring, maybe, and it represents clearly something that's extinct and ties into my interest in obsolescence and whatnot. And as Charo says, also museum display, although this way of displaying it that the staff at the CAG came up with, I think is perfect. But what's displayed is this quite rough object. And so this kind of museum culture interest in display is fundamental here as well. And of course, if we think of dinosaur skeletons in museums and whatnot, they're the prototypical object put on display, very dramatic and beautifully put together. The exhibition that this was in, it was formerly at the Kamloops Art Gallery, an exhibition called Proximities, Artist Statements in Their Work. And so artists were invited into that exhibition to explore some some aspect of their practice carried over time, and to take the way that artists normally write about their work and ask if that could be conveyed through some physical manifestation, creating some artwork. And so I looked at this dinosaur bone as being this thing that's flowed not just through my artwork in a way, but through the family as a whole, as a precursor to many of my works. Very latent, kind of not overt, but kind of perhaps below the surface, so to speak. The other case that's here has a number of other family artifacts, and they represent, they show the way that the bone has been understood not just in the context of my work in this exhibition, but by the family as a whole, as this important object in the family's history. And my brother Ian, who writes young adult fiction, was a journalist in the early 90s around that time, and wrote a couple of newspaper articles that talk about the bone and about collecting and artifacts and things like that. So they're in here, along with photographs of the site of the bone being excavated, and also a map drawn by my father prior to creating the video to kind of be able to talk through the importance of this and the site. So alongside the photographs in the case of Hamish excavating the bone are a couple of photographs, Polaroids, of the skeletal structure for the Torham van. And so that idea of the skin on frame skeletal construction that Charo mentioned early on in the tour here, I think of that as being like the way a dinosaur skeleton is, skeletal, reconstructed, and although not so much in artifacts, there's a few rare examples, but of course a skin covering that skeleton. And also that a lot of my interest in kayaks are like that. Of course, a lot of historical kayaks are skin on frame constructions, as are many later European takes on them.
So we're standing in the resource area of the exhibition now, and this will include a drawing activity for visitors, as well as resources with a takeaway booklet that will include some photocopied texts that are part of Don's references, as well as all the exhibition label text. So that'll be a takeaway for visitors. We also wanted to really establish Donald's early interests, so we've included some childhood drawings, as well as some really important books that you use in your own research, and optical devices as well.
Sure, it's a collection of those kind of varied interests. And so from some of the early drawings, like an early childhood drawing of a tent, a drawing done with a screwdriver here on a piece of wood of a lighthouse from Peggy's Cove, and then, as Charo says, some of these books that show optical apparatus and whatnot from the 19th century, the very complex technology of a lighthouse, again now kind of like, maybe it's obsolete, maybe it's not. It perhaps depends who you ask. So that's kind of interesting to me. A camera lucida, kind of not a camera obscura, but a camera lucida, another optical device of the early 19th century. And all of these things are in these display cases that, to some degree, kind of mimic the look of a museum in the 19th century, but are objects I've made recently for a couple of different exhibitions, and that we thought would be nice to include in here. Okay, I'll just talk about a few of the things in here. There's a drawing here from a museum in Dresden in Germany of an early lens, be from about 1600, late 1500s. And it's very precious historical lens that might have been used by Johannes Kepler and perhaps contemporaries in some early optical experiments. There's a piece of the transatlantic cable from 1858 that was the first link between the continents that way, if you like, and as many theorists have talked about, a kind of a precursor to the internet, and otherwise just a piece of rusted cable that's been preciously kept and turned into a souvenir, and sold as a souvenir in the 19th century. And the childhood drawing of one of the tents And here are a couple of seaside postcards showing these pavilion-like structures, which are actually cameras obscura. And one of these South End Pier is a place that my father would have gone to on holidays, and he very clearly remembers going into this camera obscura. And a study just from last year of the Great Union Camera Obscura on the Isle of Man, which dates from the 1890s. So it's one of these historical places that you can go and see today that gives a sense of what visual culture was like in the 19th century.
And there's an actual ticket?
Yeah, there's a ticket here to the most wonderful site in the Crystal Palace is in the South Corridor, opposite the Crystal Fountain, and it's a camera obscura. And so that was part of the well-known Crystal Palace. It was the site of the 1851 exhibition in London. And I don't know for sure, but I'd like to think that my grandfather might have seen that, because I know that he saw the Crystal Palace before it burned down in the 1920s. Jeff the Duck as a diver, and a boiler from the Michigan wrecked in 1893 that I photographed on the West Coast Trail in the early 1980s. So my interest in those kind of things goes back in moderate ways at least.
Yeah, and including all of these pieces, I think it really, for me, tells the story even from your childhood of these enduring interests. And I don't know how many people have these kind of objects from their childhood and have kept them for this long, but it traces these interests as being a thread that continues. Yeah. So now we're in the second section of the exhibition, which focuses on themes relating to Donald's interest in the convergence of art and science and technology, specifically through his cameras obscura works. And some of the main themes that will come out as Donald talks about each of these projects are around site specificity. So each of these camera obscura projects was made for a specific site, and there's a lot of research and interest in the history of each site that goes into that. And then also the sculptural approaches that we saw in the earlier works are still held true in the way that he constructs these sculptures. And of course the use of the model as well.
Sure, and so this is a model created in 2016 representing an artwork which is behind us here, created in 2015. So it's a model of a camera obscura. And the term camera obscura comes from about 1604, 1606, something like that, from Johannes Kepler. And it's a Latin phrase that simply means dark room. So camera is room and obscura is dark. And so the idea of a camera obscura at the time was that it would be a darkened space that light would enter into through either an open aperture, a small hole, or through a lens, and lens technology was emerging at the time. And an image of whatever is outside, so in this case Charo, would be cast inside onto a screen or perhaps onto a table, upside down and backwards. And so this was maybe not quite a merging of art and science at the time, because they weren't really separate. It was an indistinguishable realm between art and science and perhaps entertainment. And later they diverged. And so people like Johannes Kepler were polymaths. They had all these different interests in astronomy, optics, physiology, how the human eye works. And so it was through the creation of these structures that solar phenomena were studied, and that understandings of how human vision worked were studied or proven. And those studies go way back. Ibn al-Hattan, an Islamic scholar, used many camera obscura devices to study these same principles, and drawing upon ancient Greek and perhaps Chinese theory to do so. So there's a long history to this. Except for the childhood works that are in the educational space and whatnot, this is the earliest work in the exhibition. It's from 1987, and it represents the first camera obscura that I made. I was an MFA student at York University at the time, and those of us in the program decided to create a temporary 2-week-long exhibition of outdoor art. And I'd read about these public walk-in camera obscuras that were in Europe in the 19th century and whatnot. I hadn't yet seen one, but I thought I'll create one. So I created this tent-like structure that you would enter into, and the model represents the first of 2 versions of it. In this case, the idea that a participant would sit in a chair inside the structure and be turned around by people outside. And I like that idea. I may even build it someday, but it wasn't approved for safety reasons. So I kind of hastily, I had a night to redesign it. So I came up with this other idea of a lightweight structure suspended within a kind of a skeletal outer supporting structure. And people would enter into this, and then it turned very easily. So it was suspended off the middle and turned. And so as you entered into it, you'd find it would move, and you'd walk it in a circle. And so it gave this kind of panoramic view of the York campus. And we produced this kind of DIY catalog using typewriters and photocopiers as technology at the time to produce this catalog, including with photographs taken the day the exhibition opened in the catalog. So we kind of figured out how to do this as a group. There was quite a long gap, actually, before I created another camera obscura work. And the one that I created next was this one here, One Eye Folly. It was created in 2008 for an exhibition called Ice Follies at North Bay, Ontario, by the WKP Kennedy Gallery. It's actually biannual. They invite artists every couple of years. And what they ask the artist to do is to create an artwork that somehow is a takeoff on the idea of an ice fishing hut. And then all of these works are exhibited on, in some cases created on, frozen Lake Nipissing. And then people come out and view the works once the exhibition's open. And so One Eye Folly, for me, was a return to the interest in the camera obscura. It'd been quite a long time since I'd created one. And the pinhole cameras, they were kind of like a like-minded interest between that time. But here I decided for Ice Follies to create a camera obscura as an ice fishing hut, or vice versa. It's got this structure built on top of the hull of a rowboat. The rowboat was given to me by a friend, Andrew Wong. He had built it. And then it's got this kind of wood frame construction clad in these kind of 19th century tin ceiling tiles with an open aperture at the front, and then these hatches that close up to make a light-proof structure. And then you'll see from the inside that I think of it kind of almost like a cave-like space inside. It has these little niches for matches and a candle and a lantern and things like that. Again, hearkening back perhaps to the way I created the sled. And then the whole thing imagined as this boat that once the ice melts, that the boat will be floating there. And again, it's kind of, it functions as a camera obscura, and it functioned very nicely, but is otherwise, again, a kind of a fanciful construction. And so from that, and you see it documented here in photographs and a preliminary drawing for it. And from that work, then I became interested in that idea of being inside a boat that's a camera obscura. And so that led to the next work that we'll see here. Okay, so making the One Eye Folly prompted me to want to create another work that would be a camera obscura as a boat, or vice versa. And so I took a Klepper kayak, a German kayak constructed in the 1960s. It's a folding kayak, so it has a skeleton and then this rubberized skin that goes over it. And it's one that's important to me, again, as a kind of an artifact. I'd used it for trips twice to the Outer Hebrides in Scotland, and the trip along the eastern coast of Maine, was with this kayak. And so I think of it now as having kind of retired into an art career, and it's become this floating camera obscura called Kepler's Klepper. So it puts together the idea of the Klepper kayak and Johannes Kepler and the invention of the camera obscura. So the video here shows the camera obscura being used on the Tamar River in Tasmania. So this whole work was created in 2011 during an artist residency there, and filmed in different places along the Tamar River to represent this kind of journey with it. And you'll see me kind of navigating the kayak by way of this very small and inverted image. And so it became a curious process of having to kinetically learn how to navigate the boat based on this inverted image. And that interested me as a problem, and also how easy it would be to become accustomed to doing that. The filming itself was done mostly by towing a video camera on a small raft behind the kayak, and then for a few scenes anchoring it and then paddling towards it.
So with the Kepler's Klepper, we see you having the individual experience in the kayak. And the works behind us, Kitty Vitty and the Coastal Camera Obscura, and then the Nanton project, are all cameras obscura that you invite the public to come in and experience. So that's been not necessarily a new thing, but something that you've really been investigating more, I would say, in your work recently, is that participatory experience. Certainly, like, the experience is uncanny, and so entering this darkened space and seeing it for yourself, that inverted view, is really important to kind of transformative experiences for the viewer.
Sure, and as you mentioned earlier, there's an interest in many of my works to respond into a specific site. Mm-hmm. So I think each of these works does that. It takes that interest in wanting to put the viewer, the participant, inside that optical experience of the camera obscura, and to do so in relation to some particular location. So this work, it's kind of two separate works and one work at the same time. It came from that the Kepler's Klepper, as you said, the individual experience, kind of like the sled that way, to wanting to share that with a wider audience. So it was created for Art Marathon, a 48-hour arts festival run by Eastern Edge Gallery in Newfoundland that goes all day and all night. And so this was one work for that. And so it sat in Kitty Vitty Harbor, a small historic harbor, just a couple of miles from the main harbor of St. John's, Newfoundland. And so it was imagined as this floating structure that you would enter into by kayak. And then once you were inside it, then you would see a projected image of the Kitty Vitty landscape surrounding it. And then this is kind of like an overhead view, of sort of like a plan view of it. That work was reimagined, pieces of it kept, like the tent covering kept, and then reconstructed as a project with other sites in Vancouver, in False Creek in 2017, as what I'm now calling the Coastal Camera Obscura. And so it's now basically a kit that can be reassembled at different locations. And so here it's seen in False Creek, where it sat for about a week. And we used Habitat Island as a kind of a base for it, and the beach there as a staging ground for running kayak tours out to it. And the recreational boating community of False Creek, which is kind of interesting in the context of the Romantic Commodities work, and that kind of wilderness within the city feel, or vice versa. Other participants would come by with their own boats, with canoes and with paddle boards and things like that. So we just welcomed whoever could fit inside it, and otherwise ran it as a kind of like mini guided kayak tours to this artwork. And then that was closely paralleled in time to the Midnight Sun Camera Obscura project up in Dawson City, Yukon. which myself and a number of people organized. There were about 13 visual artists creating these off-site projects around the city, including the one that's represented here that where I put a camera obscura onto the side of the George Black Ferry that crosses the Yukon River. And we had numerous scholars involved in that with interest in the history of cameras obscura. And so we had this kind of hybrid arts festival, academic symposia, involving lots of artists, very community engaged, numerous TRU and one NASCAD student involved in it and having an exhibition of their own work as a part of it. So quite a kind of a multivariate event. And also with a couple of other TRU faculty, Leah Bucknell and Ernie Kroger involved, along with many TRU students. And then that exhibition, following from the Midnights in Camera Obscura project, there was an exhibition here at the Kamloops Art Gallery in 2016, representing what happened in Dawson City here, and then a traveling exhibition emerging out of the University of Lethbridge. And then maybe that brings us to the last project here, which is another one with the University of Lethbridge, and it's the creation of a permanent camera obscura, the Nanton Camera Obscura, named for being at Nanton, Alberta, where the university owns the Coots property, the Coots Centre for Western Canadian Heritage, a former farm property that's now being used by the university as a kind of a meeting convention center place and also an interest in creating contemporary artworks on site. So what I did for it with the invitation of the curator there, Josie Mills, was took a grain bin from the 1920s, something that's not much use to the farmers in the area. It's a tiny diminutive grain bin in comparison to the modern large industrial ones. So they said, sure, you can have that. And so I converted it into a camera obscura by building a large circular table inside with the help of a couple of research assistants, Levi Glass and Garnet Dirksen. And Ryland Forty helped me with some measuring and surveying of the site first. And then with Jim McCarthy and welding at TRU, so this is the whole TRU experience, creating this top for this welded structure at the top that's the optical mechanism for it that rotates around. And it does so by way of this gearing system that I designed, and that carries the gearing down inside the structure, and there you can kind of turn it around with a wheel. And so it rotates the structure on the top, creating this sort of panoramic moving image on the table, basically carrying on the same kind of design principle that was developed for those seaside cameras obscura that we saw in postcards in the education section back there and whatnot. And the last part here has a case that shows some of the careful planning drawings for this, which were necessary for the approval of it as a project. And one more of the journals, and that's a journal not of a camera obscura, but a study of another 18th century construction in Friesland in northern Netherlands, the Eisinger Planetarium, named for and by Eisinger, who turned his whole house, his whole place of business also into a walk-in planetarium with the motions of the planets and the sun being driven by this very complex gearing system, likely inspired by windmills in the area. And so I drew upon the technology of that I'd observed through these studies to carry a bit of that into this structure here.
So the final work to mention will soon be installed on the Paramount Theatre. The inherent nature of cameras obscura is that they need daylight to appear, and so that's a project that you've been working on that we'll be able to install soon and give tours of, and so maybe we can end on about that work.
Sure. So with thanks to the Kamloops Film Society and Paramount Theatre, it'll be right across the road and open for kind of weekly tours. We'll figure out a schedule for those. and it'll invite participants basically to enter into the theater and go up the steps into the area roughly around where the projection room is, and then walk out onto the canopy. But rather than just going right onto the canopy, people will turn and go into this tent-like structure, which is basically a kind of a 1960s, 1970s perhaps, pioneer family tent that I've kind of reconfigured and reshaped, that will have a set of 3 seats inside it to view a camera obscura projection looking back down Victoria Street.
And so our hope is that people can actually have the experience,
Yeah.
because that's so important to these.
Yeah, as a way of giving an enhanced understanding of what these works here are about. So.